Picture a general standing on a road in South Korea on the morning of December 26, 1950. The road is going south. The men on it are going south. The trucks, the equipment, the faces on either side of him, all going south. The general is the only thing not moving. He is watching. He has just arrived, and he is wearing 2 grenades on his chest. The man who sent for him was 6,000 miles away in Tokyo, cabling Washington for permission to use nuclear weapons. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway had commanded the 82nd Airborne. He had jumped into Normandy. He understood, in the specific way that only a lifetime soldier understands, what an army looks like when it's fighting. What he found on the road north of Seoul on December 26th did not look like that. It also didn't look like defeat, which is a different thing than most people assume it is. Defeat has a shape. Broken units, scattered equipment, men separated from their commands and moving without order. What Ridgway found was more organized than that, and worse for being organized. Trucks moving in column, units still intact, still under command, still capable of turning and fighting. They simply weren't turning. The retreat behind him covered roughly 275 miles, the longest sustained withdrawal in American military history, stretching back through weeks of contact with a Chinese force that had crossed the Yalu River in numbers nobody in Tokyo had planned for. Lieutenant General Walton Walker had commanded the 8th Army through all of it, holding a force together under conditions that would have broken most commands entirely. He had died 3 days earlier, on December 23rd, when his Jeep collided with a South Korean military truck on this same road. His death was not the cause of what Ridgway was looking at. It was simply the door that had opened. The 8th Army had a name, inside its own ranks, for what it was doing. Soldiers and officers called it bug-out fever, a documented term used at the time for a specific reflex. Contact with the enemy, followed by withdrawal, followed by more contact, followed by more withdrawal. Not panic in the sense of men running blindly, something more disciplined and more troubling. An institutional habit, a learned response. The men on this road had been taught, over the preceding weeks, a specific lesson, that staying cost more than leaving. Nobody had taught it to them directly. Nobody had stood up and said the words. They had learned it the way soldiers learn everything that matters, by watching what happened to the units that stayed and what happened to the units that didn't, and drawing the obvious conclusion. He did not arrive to assess the tactical situation. He arrived to find out why his soldiers had stopped believing they should fight. What Ridgway did in his first hours is documented in his own later account, Soldier, published in 1956. He did not convene a staff meeting first. He did not begin by reviewing maps in a headquarters tent. He moved toward the front, toward the units in contact, toward the specific soldiers who had been making the specific decision, morning after morning, to leave positions rather than hold them. The 2 grenades were already part of his uniform by the time he reached Korea, a personal habit from earlier commands, worn on a harness across his chest, functional rather than ceremonial. But on a road full of men who hadn't seen a general anywhere near the front in longer than they could easily remember, the grenades registered as something else before anyone understood who he was. A soldier on that road, watching the Jeep come north against the flow of traffic, watching a general step out armed and moving forward rather than back, that soldier didn't need to know Ridgway's name yet. He needed to register one fact. Somebody with stars on his collar was going the wrong direction. Nobody had seen that in weeks. Ridgway's approach to the units he visited followed a pattern that would define his first days in command. He asked specific questions, not questions about troop strength or enemy positions, the kind of questions a new commander is expected to ask first. He asked when the men had last eaten something hot. He asked where their winter clothing was. He asked what they needed that they didn't have. These are not the questions of a man assessing a battle plan. They are the questions of a man diagnosing something else entirely. And the answers he was getting in the last week of December 1950 were not going to be found in any operational report already sitting on a desk in Tokyo. 6,000 miles away, in the Daiichi building, General Douglas MacArthur was working a different problem with a different set of tools. He had cabled Washington requesting authority to use nuclear weapons against targets in China and Manchuria. The cables are part of the documented record. Washington did not respond to them the way MacArthur wanted. Ridgway hadn't seen those cables yet. He was still on the road, still asking his soldiers when they had last eaten. The two men were looking at the same war from 6,000 miles apart, and neither of them yet understood how differently they had each defined what was broken. The Daiichi building in Tokyo had been the headquarters of a Japanese insurance company before General Douglas MacArthur made it the seat of supreme command for Allied powers in the Pacific. It had marble floors and high windows and a view that did not include Korea. MacArthur worked from a map. This is not a criticism. It is simply the tool of his level of command, and it had served him with extraordinary effectiveness across a career that ran from the amphibious brilliance of Incheon back through decades of theater-level strategic thinking that few American commanders of his generation could match. He read the war the way a man reads a chessboard: positions, movements, the large shape of an operation across a peninsula, a coastline, a continent. What that map did not show him was whether a specific rifle company on a specific hill had eaten anything hot in 3 days. His cables to Washington in December of 1950 requested authority to use nuclear weapons against targets in China and Manchuria, a request grounded in the same operational logic that had guided him through years of Pacific strategy. If the Chinese intervention could not be contained by conventional means on the peninsula, the reasoning ran, then the source of that intervention needed to be addressed at its root, by whatever means were available and proportionate to the scale of the threat. This was not an irrational request from an irrational man. It was the request of a commander whose entire professional instrument had been calibrated for a different kind of war. A war of theaters and strategic objectives where the correct response to an overwhelming enemy advance was to consider overwhelming force in return. Washington did not grant the authority. The cables remained part of the documented record regardless. He was not ignoring his men on that road north of Seoul. He was fighting the war that existed on the map in his headquarters, a war of Chinese divisions, strategic depth, and the calculus of great powers, rather than the one that existed on the ground, where a rifleman's decision to hold the position for one more night depended on variables no map could register. There is a specific kind of institutional injury that doesn't show up in casualty reports. An army has a circulatory system, in the sense that any large organization does. Command intent flows outward from the center, and information about conditions flows back in. When that system is working, a general far from the front still knows, in some functional sense, what his soldiers are experiencing, and his soldiers still feel some connection to a command structure that is paying attention to them. By December of 1950, something in that system had stopped functioning between Tokyo and the front lines in Korea. The distance was not just geographic. 6,000 miles is a fact of the map, and armies have functioned across greater distances than that. The distance was in what each end of that connection believed the other needed to know. Tokyo needed strategic assessments, troop dispositions, the shape of the Chinese advance. The front needed someone to ask about socks. Neither end was wrong about what it needed. Neither end was providing what the other actually required to function. Ridgway, in his first days of command, was beginning to understand this gap, not through analysis and not through anything he said publicly. He understood it the way a field commander understands things, by standing in the positions his soldiers were standing in and noticing what wasn't there. He did not hold a press conference to announce his diagnosis. He did not send a cable to Tokyo explaining what he'd found. What he did instead was quieter, and in the context of what would happen over the following weeks, considerably more consequential. He started asking his own questions, at his own level, and writing down the answers. This misunderstanding between Tokyo and the road was not a character flaw in either man. It was an institutional one. And institutional problems require a different kind of solution than a cable to Washington. If this is the kind of military history you want more of, subscribe. One story like this every week. By the first week of January, Ridgway had established a pattern that would define his command. He visited frontline units directly and repeatedly, not as a formality, not as the kind of morale-boosting appearance a new commander makes once and then delegates to his staff, but as a sustained operational habit. This is documented in his own account, Soldier, and in the operational record of the 8th Army during this period. He went forward. He kept going forward. The questions he asked, according to his documented approach during these visits, were specific rather than general. Not, "How is morale?" a question that invites a rehearsed answer from any soldier who has learned what his officers want to hear. He asked when men had last eaten a hot meal. He asked whether they had adequate winter clothing for the temperatures dropping across the Korean peninsula in January. He asked what specific equipment was missing from specific units. These questions produced specific answers, and the answers were the diagnosis. What he learned, moving from position to position, was that the retreat had not been primarily a failure of courage or a failure of tactics. It had been, in significant part, a failure of the institution to demonstrate to its own soldiers that anyone above them was paying attention to whether they lived through the winter. Cold soldiers do not simply suffer physically, though they do that too. They draw conclusions. A man standing in wet boots, in sub-freezing temperatures, eating cold rations because the supply chain hadn't reliably delivered hot food, begins to form a specific judgment about his own value to the institution he serves. That judgment doesn't need to be spoken aloud to affect what happens the next time the enemy attacks. Ridgway ordered warm clothing moved forward. He ordered hot food and coffee established on the line, as close to the front as logistics would allow. These were not, in the context of what Ridgway was actually trying to fix, primarily supply decisions. He did not come to Korea to run a better commissary. He came to demonstrate, through the most concrete means available to him, that the institution above these soldiers had started paying attention again. One documented aspect of this period involved Ridgway's direct engagement with division-level commanders, a process that would, within weeks, result in several officers being relieved of their commands. That confrontation belongs to the next chapter. What belongs here is what happened at the level below them, among the soldiers themselves, in the days immediately following the arrival of warm clothing and hot coffee, at forward positions that had gone without both for weeks. According to accounts from this period, something shifted that wasn't captured in any single order or directive. Soldiers who had been retreating on contact began, in specific documented instances, holding their ground longer. Not because a new tactical doctrine had been issued, not because reinforcements had arrived. None had. The same men, the same weapons, the same enemy across the same terrain. What had changed was smaller than a doctrine and larger than a supply shipment. The trucks kept arriving. The food kept being hot. Somewhere in that repetition, not the first delivery, but the fact that it kept happening, something in how these soldiers understood their own position in the war began to shift. The army did not know yet that it had stopped retreating. It only knew that it was warm. The officers Ridgway relieved in his first weeks of command were not fired for being afraid. This distinction matters, and it's worth being precise about it, because it's the difference between a purge and a diagnosis. Fear in combat is not a disciplinary offense. It is a universal condition that every competent commander has felt, and every honest one admits to. What Ridgway was looking for, moving through his command structure in late December and January, was something different. Officers whose fear, or whose institutional exhaustion, had become contagious downward through their own chain of command. He did not fire generals because they had lost confidence. He fired them because they were spending it, passing it down the chain until the men at the bottom, the ones actually holding the line, had none left to draw on. The mechanism was straightforward, even if the individual conversations were not. A division commander whose own reports and orders communicated resignation rather than resolve was, in Ridgway's assessment, actively degrading the fighting capacity of every unit beneath him, regardless of that commander's personal courage or professional competence in other respects. The problem wasn't cowardice. The problem was transmission. An army is, among other things, a communication system for institutional confidence. And a commander who had stopped believing his own units could hold ground was broadcasting that belief downward, whether he intended to or not. At least one division commander was relieved during this period on grounds consistent with this standard, according to the documented record of Ridgway's early command. The specific conversations in which this happened are not fully preserved in the public record, and reconstructing their exact content would mean inventing detail that doesn't exist in the sources. What is documented is the outcome and the standard behind it. An officer being relieved under these circumstances would have seen the same 2 grenades on Ridgway's chest that soldiers on the retreat road had seen weeks earlier. Different context, same signal. The man delivering this news was not doing so from a headquarters 6,000 miles removed from the consequences of the decision. He had been forward. He had been asking soldiers about their boots. Whatever authority he was exercising in that moment, it wasn't the authority of distance. Above Ridgway, the pressure from Tokyo continued. MacArthur's cables requesting nuclear authorization against Chinese and Manchurian targets were part of the same period during which Ridgway was requesting winter jackets and ammunition resupply for the 2nd Division. Both requests moved up their respective chains. Both reflected genuine assessments of what each man believed the crisis required. MacArthur was not the villain of this moment, and framing him as one would miss what actually happened. He was a commander of exceptional documented ability, operating with a toolkit built for exactly the kind of theater-level, strategic-scale warfare he had waged with devastating success from Leyte Gulf through Incheon. That toolkit was not built for a crisis of institutional confidence occurring at the level of individual rifle companies in individual valleys. He relieved commanders of his own during this period by his own authority and judgment. His method was different. His scale was different. His distance from the specific problem Ridgway was solving was, in the end, the entire difference. 2 generals, 2 frames. One war viewed from 2 altitudes that rarely intersected. Ridgway absorbed what came down from Tokyo, the pressure, the strategic anxiety, the institutional weight of a theater commander who believed nuclear authorization might be necessary. And he did not pass that pressure down to the soldiers under his own command. What reached the front line from Ridgway's headquarters was not Tokyo's anxiety. It was warm coffee, and an officer corps increasingly aware that defeatism, once identified, would end a career. Both things were happening in the same army, at the same time, transmitted through the same chain of command, arriving at completely different destinations. On January 25, 1951, the 8th Army moved north. 30 days had passed since Ridgway stood on that road watching men move in the opposite direction.
Think about that for a second. 30 days from the longest sustained retreat in American military history to a coordinated offensive advance. No reinforcements had arrived from the United States. No new weapon systems had reached the front. No strategic reserve had been committed. It was, in the most literal sense available, the same army, the same divisions, the same soldiers, largely the same officers below the level of the ones who had been relieved, facing the same Chinese forces across the same terrain that had pushed them south for weeks. What had changed could not be measured in equipment or manpower. Operation Thunderbolt advanced methodically, with a deliberate emphasis on maintaining contact between units and controlling the pace of the advance rather than racing forward the way earlier operations in the war had done.
This was in itself a signal of what had changed in how the Army was being commanded. Not reckless momentum, but controlled, sustained pressure, executed by units that were once again holding their ground when they made contact, rather than withdrawing from it. The Chinese forces facing the 8th Army in late January and February encountered something different from what they had faced in December. The operational record shows a Chinese advance that stalled, then reversed over the following weeks. A shift documented in the campaign's outcome, even where the internal Chinese assessment of why it happened is less fully available in the Western record. What is available is the result. The line that had bent south for 275 miles began in January to hold, and then to move in the other direction. Seoul was retaken on March 14th and 15th, 1951. Ridgway was present through this advance in the same way he had been present during the retreat, forward, visible, wearing the same 2 grenades that soldiers on the road south had noticed weeks earlier without knowing his name. The road north passed through the same territory the road south had covered in December. Same terrain, same checkpoints, same distances measured in the opposite direction. Soldiers who had watched a general drive north against the flow of retreating traffic in December were now, in January and February, driving north themselves, past the same landmarks, toward the same city, under a command structure that had spent 30 days demonstrating, through hot coffee and warm jackets and relieved officers, that someone above them was paying attention. He did not celebrate the advance as it happened. His own account and the documented record of this period suggest a man already looking ahead to the next problem, the next stretch of line, the next unit that might need attention, the next indication of where the institutional connection between command and soldier might be fraying again. The Army held the line. The question that nobody in Washington had time to ask, in the middle of an active offensive, was why it hadn't held the line in October. Before the Chinese intervention, before the retreat, before 275 miles had to be given up and then taken back at whatever cost that required. General Douglas MacArthur was relieved of command by President Truman on April 11, 1951. The timing sits where it sits, 4 months after Ridgway's arrival in Korea, in the middle of a war whose trajectory had already been altered by what happened on the ground during those first 30 days. No further comment is needed on what that timing means. It means what it means. Ridgway succeeded MacArthur as Supreme Commander. The war itself continued for 2 more years beyond that point. The armistice was not signed until July 27, 1953. Nothing about Operation Thunderbolt or the retaking of Seoul ended the Korean War. What Ridgway's 30 days accomplished was narrower and, in its own way, more foundational. He stopped an army from continuing to lose faith in itself, and he restored its capacity to hold ground and take it back. The war that followed was fought by an army capable of fighting it. MacArthur returned to the United States and addressed Congress. His public life after relief is its own documented record. The farewell address, the years afterward, a long public silence on the specific question of what Ridgway had accomplished in the months following his own departure from command. That silence is not proof of anything beyond itself. It simply sits in the record, undisturbed, the way institutional silences usually do. Walton Walker's death on December 23rd had opened the door through which Ridgway walked. The road north that the 8th Army traveled in the spring of 1951 passed through the same stretch of highway where Walker's Jeep had collided with a military truck 4 months earlier. This detail belongs here, stated once, without further comment. Ridgway's later career carried Korea forward in ways that weren't obvious in 1951. He was named Supreme Allied Commander Europe in 1952, succeeding Eisenhower. He served as Army Chief of Staff from 1953 to 1955, and in that role, according to his own documented account in Soldier, he opposed the Eisenhower administration's New Look defense policy, which prioritized nuclear weapons over the conventional forces he had spent a career commanding. This opposition is the final echo of Korea in his professional life. A general who had watched an institution nearly lose a war through distance, through strategic abstraction, through the belief that the largest possible weapon was the answer to a crisis that had actually required proximity and attention. That general spent his final years in uniform arguing against exactly that same institutional instinct, applied now at the scale of national defense policy rather than a single Korean winter. He had asked his soldiers when they'd last eaten hot food. Years later, from a much larger chair, he was still arguing that the answer to that kind of question mattered more than the size of the weapon in reserve. One soldier, unnamed in the available record, walked south on that road in December of 1950 and walked north on the same road in March of 1951. Same boots. A warmer jacket by then, if the supply chain had reached him the way it reached most of the 2nd Division by January. Not a hero in any way the record singles out, just a man who was still alive in March, having been part of an army that 2 months earlier had been running. That is what the 30 days built. Korea is remembered, when it's remembered at all, as the Forgotten War. What's forgotten inside that forgetting is a specific stretch of 30 days in January, when one general drove north against the flow of his own retreating army, asked his soldiers what they needed, and then went and got it for them. MacArthur asked Washington for nuclear weapons. Ridgway asked his soldiers when they'd last eaten hot food. The army that held the line answered Ridgway's question. If Walker survives that Jeep accident on December 23rd, does Ridgway ever get the call? Does the line hold without him? Leave it below. I read every one.